Within hours of the bombing, a phone call is received and recorded at the New York Daily News.
Hi, this is the Liberation Army. We conducted the explosion at the World Trade Center. You will get...
Nightline has learned that some of the suspects in the bombing had been under FBI investigation and had previously been questioned by the FBI.
Some of the individuals involved in this case came to our attention. As you can imagine, alertness, sensitivity to security matters was really at an all-time high during the Gulf War.
Indeed, some of the suspects may have had a relationship of even longer standing with other U.S. government agencies.
This is an ABC News Nightline Investigation. World Trade Center, Ground Zero. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
Usually, the way we report a news story is to give the newest, the most dramatic, and the most important information first. But sometimes, especially where an investigation is involved, it makes more sense to begin at the bottom and work your way up. Let me throw out a few seemingly unrelated facts. Fact: back in the early 80s, one of the pillars of U.S. foreign policy was something called the Reagan Doctrine. It was designed to counter communist gains in the Third World. It was why Washington supported the Contras in Nicaragua and Muslim fundamentalists, the Mujahideen, in Afghanistan. Fact: 2 years ago, when U.S. armed forces first bombed and then invaded Iraq, the FBI here at home significantly beefed up its surveillance of suspected or potential Muslim terrorists. Fact: immediately after the bombing of the World Trade Center, initial speculation focused on Serbian suspects, so that when the New York Daily News, the day after the bombing, got this particular phone call on one of its news tip lines, no one paid any particular attention until weeks later, just a couple of days ago, in fact.
Hi, this is the Liberation Army. We conducted the explosion at the World Trade Center.
Eventually, all of these apparently unrelated facts will come together in an event that is about to occur near the southernmost tip of Manhattan Island. But on Friday morning of February 26th, there is absolutely no reason for anyone to pay particular attention as a Ford Econoline van is driven onto the B2 level of the World Trade Center parking garage. The van swung past an enclosed U.S. government parking area in which the New York office of the Secret Service kept most of its vehicles. The van drove on, turning a corner and eventually pulling over to the right side of the ramp, directly underneath the Vista Hotel, alongside this wall of the North Tower, Tower 1 of the World Trade Center. It is down here that the bombing takes place. At precisely 12:18, the biggest terrorist explosion in the history of the United States inflicts 6 fatalities, more than 1,000 injuries, and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of damage. Let me try and orient you a little bit. This is where the bomb went off, essentially what is referred to as the epicenter of the blast. Where I am standing, there is no floor here anymore, but this used to be parking level B2 of the World Trade Center, Tower number 1. This was the ramp that led out of the parking area. About 100 yards behind me over there is where the Secret Service had its parking lot with its limousines and its chase cars. This is almost exactly where the van in which the investigators believe the bomb was planted was parked. Right behind me here, what used to be a 14-inch thick wall. That was the exterior wall of the World Trade Center, and on the other side of that wall is where most of the people who were killed in this blast died. It is amid the rubble of the explosion that investigators literally begin trying to put the pieces of what happened together. That story when we come back.
This land was his land, but the government wanted it bad. How bad?
They were going to use any means they could to get it.
2020 investigates, Friday.
Saturday, February 27th, the morning after. One of the FBI's top explosives experts, Dave Williams, arrives from Washington.
Very hectic initially getting here, and with a 2-hour walkthrough, I was able to immediately conclude that it was an explosive device. At this time, it was decided that it was involving a terrorist incident, and the FBI would be the lead agency. I recognize this as being the largest improvised explosive device or bomb that had detonated in the United States.
If you look at various clues in this tangled mess here, we can determine exactly where the blast occurred. And we do that by looking at the vehicles, we do that by looking at the extent of the damage, and very shortly you're brought to a particular area where the damage is most severe and where the detonation occurred.
The investigators were quickly able to determine that the source of the blast was along this exit ramp in the parking garage under the Vista Hotel. The explosion tore through this wall of the basement of Tower 1 of the World Trade Center. It ripped through several rooms in which employees of the Port Authority were working and having lunch.
In this particular room, 3 lives were lost. This piece of steel that you see right here, badly twisted, was hurled through the room that most of the people were killed and ended up traveling approximately 39 feet. The piece of steel weighs approximately 14,000 pounds. This was part of a wind shear support for the side of the building, the Trade Tower 1.
If you take a look at that beam there, it's very easy to determine that the blast occurred on this side of the beam, and it's directing us the exact area where the detonation occurred.
The site of the explosion was relatively easy to find. Also, the bomb was too big to have been brought in by hand. Some sort of vehicle brought it in. That was just a logical inference. But it did give investigators something to look for, even if it would be a search for the proverbial needle in a haystack. They were counting on spending weeks, if not months, down here.
On Sunday night, I had established that we needed people to get into the crater area and take swabbings for explosive residue examinations. Along with them was a young man from the New York City Police Department and an ATF agent.
It was really our first time down in the bottom of the building to see the extent of damage, and we were attempting to determine the direction, where the vehicle was that caused the damage, that caused the explosion. So we had worked our way all the way around. What you see now is pristine. All of the tubing and cables that you see were down. And in this area were vehicles that were blown on top of one another. What I was looking for as a bomb tech was possible vehicle fragments. We were going ahead marking what we thought would be good places. It was during that marking process that I located a ring gear that goes in a differential. I knew it took a tremendous explosive force to blow that ring gear out of there. The more we looked, the more we found. Then we found a differential housing, ultimately a section of frame with a number on it.
They brought it to the police laboratory. The technicians were able to raise that number and trace it to the Ryder Corporation in Alabama. And from there, it brought them to Jersey City, again another Ryder location, where the vehicle was reported stolen by who? Mohammed Salama.
Potentially solve something this early into the investigation was a lucky break for us. We were going to find the part. Some people would say, well, you were lucky to find it. Not really. We were going to find that vehicle part. What was fortunate for us was that we found it so early in the investigation. It was actually located along this rim right here. They've hammered away most of the concrete, but most of the parts, the rear end parts, were found in this area here. This gave us the direction that the vehicle was taking.
They knew the direction, they knew the van had been parked. For the first time, they were able to start ruling out theories. The bomber had probably not been inside the van at the time of the explosion. No hitting a speed bump on the way out. Indeed, the parking spots seemed to have been selected with some care.
We were also told that where the vehicle was parked, routinely vehicles stopped there. But it was one of the few areas down here that someone could pass you to get around it. So we began to put it together that if it were a Ryder truck, it looked like a delivery vehicle, and no one would really suspect it. It could be parked right next to that wall. Occupants get out.
The bombers had left the scene and disappeared, but in surprisingly short order, the FBI will have 5 solid suspects in custody. Back in a moment. What investigators find in the rubble underneath the World Trade Center helps their colleagues above ground unravel a surprising amount of information in just a matter of days. They learned that the Ford Econoline van was rented at 5 p.m. Tuesday, February 23rd, from a Ryder rental lot in Jersey City by Mohammed Salameh. That, in turn, leads to the discovery that the same van had been spotted 2 days later, on Thursday, parked outside a Jersey City storage facility. Inside a locker rented by Mohammed Salameh are ingredients which could be combined to make a very large bomb. 4 phone calls are also traced to this phone inside the facility. The calls were all placed by Salameh to another suspect in the case. Much later that night, 4 o'clock Friday morning in fact, witnesses placed Salameh at this gas station, fueling the Ryder van. With Salameh, a former freedom fighter in the Afghan war, who works as a New York cab driver, Mohammed Abu Halima. It all initially flows out of Joe Hanlon's discovery of the vehicle identification number on the chassis piece buried in the rubble.
The bulk of the debris worth further examination is being removed by crane through the top of the crater area and brought down here, dumped in a pile where it's literally every grain of sand is being touched by experts in this field looking for components necessary to reconstruct the explosive device. It's a painstaking operation, and the structural people who do this for a living indicated there were about 2,500 cubic yards of debris to be moved, weighing in excess of 4,000 tons. Physically touched by each of these crime scene personnel will be about 40 tons of debris, where every grain of sand will be touched. When we get finished with the processing of this crime scene, you should be able to eat off the floor. Every bit of debris, every grain of sand will be touched, overlooking no clue so small.
When it comes down to the actual fusing or detonating device, this may have been a situation where they just struck a match, lit the fuse, and ran. It may be that simple, or it may be much more sophisticated. That's why we need to get those bomb components that we will eventually get as we comb through the rubble.
These particular vehicles acted as a net that would have caught or collected most of the components that were in and around the immediate seat of the explosion.
What they're doing is removing each vehicle, towing it to a location where it's well lighted, and then the vehicles are being processed. What they're looking for is any fragments from the vehicle that contain the explosive, as well as possibly any fragments from an initiating device, a timer or whatever was used to initiate it. We may not know what was used for some time to come. It's not something that has jumped out at us immediately.
When an explosive device detonates, through my research and experience, about 98% of that explosive device will remain.
We're waiting until we get the pieces of the device itself, a readout on the composition of the explosive, and perhaps more importantly, to find out as much as we can about the individuals who might have been involved in it.
Those individuals, apparently unaware that they had left any evidence behind, felt confident enough to take credit for the explosion with at least 1 letter and 1 phone call. The call to the New York Daily News that got lost in the shuffle.
Hi, this is the Liberation Army. We conducted the
course, you're also aware that a letter subsequently came to the New York Times. That letter claiming that the motivation for the bombing was American ties with Israel. And that letter said at one point, Israel is responsible for terrorism against Arab citizens all over the world. Now Americans must see what it feels like to be the victim of terrorism.
Think of the bomb as a massive energy source, blasting out in all directions within a confined space. Most of that energy ripped across this parking lot underneath the Vista Hotel, right up there. Several of these floors were parking areas. The steel beams that workers are installing are intended to support what is left. A huge hole was blown into the floor of B2, the parking level where the bomb was placed. It sent debris falling all the way down to level B5, where the refrigeration machinery that cools the massive towers is kept. But the explosion also generated a huge blast straight up through the lobby floor of the Vista Hotel.
It did go up through into a ballroom of the Vista, where there was to be a gathering of kids just 45 minutes later to get sports awards. The bomb went off at 12:18. They were supposed to be there at 1 o'clock. The relatively small loss of life is amazing. The amount of solid cement and steel girder that the bomb blew away will just overwhelm you.
This was the most damage that I've seen to any physical target with any explosive device, improvised explosive device, than I've seen anywhere in the world. As far as the forensic aspect of it, we're probably about 10% into it. We're going to get back into the laboratory and really get cooking.
It is from those tedious forensic investigations that prosecutors will ultimately receive much of the information from which they will build the case against the defendants. But by looking into their own existing files, the FBI has already discovered that it has dealt with some of these suspects before, more than 2 years ago. That story and more when we come back. Arrested in connection with the bombing of the World Trade Center, and only yesterday the head of the FBI's New York field office, Jim Fox, told me about a sixth man now being sought.
Ramzi Youssef is the so-called sixth man that the press has been talking about for some days. He is charged with participating in the bombing itself, not simply aiding and abetting the bombing. We've been looking for him for a number of weeks without success. If I had to guess, I would guess that he is overseas by now and that that's where he will be found.
As you have looked now and gone through the records of some of the men that have been arrested over the past few weeks, you have discovered that you'd met some of these guys before, right?
Some of the individuals have come to our attention in the past, yes they have.
Not all, but several of the suspects now being held in the World Trade Center bombing had been identified as potential terrorists more than 2 years ago. Indeed, they were brought in by the FBI for questioning.
During the Gulf War, we took very seriously the threat to the United States from terrorist elements. In fact, we tripled our commitment, agent commitment to terrorist matters during the Gulf War and thereafter. Some of the individuals involved in this case came to our attention, as you can imagine.
And it was in that context that you saw some of these men before.
That's right.
Among the charges that had been leveled but never substantiated against several of the men who are now charged in the World Trade Center bombing is that they had been overheard threatening to blow up a number of New York monuments. But back then, 2 years ago, the FBI was unable to muster enough hard information to warrant a full-scale investigation. One other intriguing element to this ongoing story. Perhaps the largest single covert operation ever launched by the CIA involved massive financial, military, and logistical support to the so-called Mujahideen, who fought against Soviet troops in Afghanistan. Many of these men moved freely back and forth between the United States and Afghanistan. Among them, some of the men now charged with bombing the World Trade Center.
I think it's generally known that some of the individuals who have been indicted participated in the Afghan fighting. One or two made several trips to fight in Afghanistan. Exactly what their relationship was with the U.S. government, if any, I don't know. There was, of course, fundraising here in New York City on a fairly large scale and recruiting in New York City of so-called Afghan freedom fighters. But I don't know what their relationship was with the U.S. government. They had none with the FBI.
What I'm suggesting is that at that time, the encouragement of these men, the support of these men was at a fairly high level. They, after all, were one of the principal pillars of the so-called Reagan doctrine. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility that they and perhaps the CIA or some agency within the Pentagon might have had a previous relationship.
It's possible that yesterday's hero is today's villain, yes.
During the war in Afghanistan, the CIA and the State Department routinely facilitated trips to Afghanistan and back into the United States for members of the Mujahideen. It is more than likely that several of the men now charged with bombing the World Trade Center were once paid and supported by agencies of the U.S. government. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. For all of us here at ABC News, good night.
Nightline is a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC.